As we're beginning Holy Week, I thought it was a good idea to do short devotional videos as we go across each day. Yesterday was Palm Sunday. Today is Holy Monday. Tomorrow will be Holy Tuesday. Wednesday is commonly referred to as Spy Wednesday, or it's the day in which Judas Iscariot went to go and betray Jesus with the chief priests and the scribes. And then Maundy, Thursday, or the day in which Jesus has the Last Supper with his disciples to celebrate the commemoration of the New Covenant and the Passover. And also Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. And if you do a Google search on the timeline of the exact dates or the exact events surrounding these dates, you'll find several different opinions. There will be some days that, for today, Holy Monday, some of them will have the cursing of the fig tree or the cleansing of the temple on this day. And then some of them will have what I'm going to be going through today is the anointing of Jesus at Bethany. Some of them are a little bit different on some of the days of Monday through Wednesday, but most scholars commonly agree on at least Palm Sunday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. Most of those are uniformly agreed upon. Now, the reason is because the gospel writers don't write in the way us Westerners always think that biography should be written, or even as they would understand biography. They wrote in more of a topical fashion. So while some gospel writers write in a more chronological fashion, such as the gospel writer Luke, he is writing to most excellent Theophilus as he writes the gospel account of Luke. But someone like Mark writes in a more topical fashion. So he's not so much concerned about, well, Jesus did this day, and then he did this next day, and it's exactly in chronological alignment. He's more concerned about doing it in a topical fashion, because all four gospel writers have an agenda. And that term agenda can seem to have a negative connotation, but they all have a purpose for why they're writing. And they're all different. Ultimately, it boils down to, yes, showing forth and telling the world about Jesus, writing an orderly account about that, but they all have different audiences in mind, and they have different purposes for why they do that, why they want to portray Jesus as Messiah. And so they're not so much concerned about, as we would like to think, if we think of biography like the prelude to someone's life, and then their birth, and then the events surrounding their life, and then their death, and then the after effect of their death, their influence after they're gone. The gospel writers weren't so much concerned about that. They do have some definite articles of chronology as far as being concerned with, of course, the birth of Jesus, and then the events surrounding the beginning before his birth, and then they have his death and Passover, and of course the resurrection. But in the middle, some of them will put different accounts in different places. Like in John's account, the anointing of Jesus at Bethany, in John chapter 12, comes before the triumphal entry. So my timeline of using the events on certain days is going to be a little bit different than some people would have it online. Now, what I'm going to read from today is going to be Matthew chapter 26, and this is Jesus being anointed by Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, at Bethany. And I'm going to be reading from Matthew's account in Matthew chapter 26. It can also be found in Mark chapter 14 and John chapter 12. Matthew chapter 26, verse 6 says, "Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, 'Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you have always the poor with you, but you will not always have me. And pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.'" Jesus is out this house reclining, and Mary comes up to him and she pours this very expensive ointment upon his head. she pours this very expensive anointing oil upon him. And this is not very common anointing oil. Sometimes anointing oil is used for daily activities, such as just getting up in the morning and preparing yourself for your day. Jesus tells the disciples in Matthew chapter 6, do not fast like the gloomy hypocrites, because they make their faces long and they mourn and they want to make sure that people know that they're fasting. But he says, rather get up in the morning and wash your face and anoint your head with oil. That was a regular activity that was done every day. Jesus also tells Simon, the Pharisee, when he comes into his house, that when this woman comes and she cries at his feet, and Simon is like, why is Jesus letting this woman touch him? Surely he knows, if he was really a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this was like, what manner of work is her type of vocation. And Jesus rebukes Simon, and he tells him, Simon, when I came in your house, you were very unhost-like. You were not a very gracious host whatsoever, because you didn't wash my feet, you didn't anoint my head with oil. That was a common thing to be a gracious host, is to anoint your guests with ointment, or to anoint them with anointing oil. And this isn't that type of anointing oil. This isn't a very common everyday use. The other gospel writers say that it's made of pure nard. And Judas in the John's account in Gospel chapter 12 says, why wasn't this sold to be used for? He gives a specific amount of 300 denarii. 300 denarii would have been a full year's wages for an average worker. That's quite a lot. Some scholars even wonder, how did she attain this anointment oil? How did she afford this? And this is quite expensive, and it's very costly. And the disciples are freaking out, because they want to know, well, this seems like a waste. You're just pouring it upon the Master, you're just pouring it upon Jesus, and yet this could have been used for poor people. Judas has a little bit more of a ulterior motive, because he's in charge of the money bag, and he would have liked some of that money himself. It would have been nice to pocket it, and they would have got a pretty good profit off of this. But Jesus rebukes them. He tells them, leave her alone, because what she's done is a very beautiful thing. She's preparing me for my burial. And of course, at that time, his disciples are still struggling with having a crucified Messiah in their minds, because having a crucified Messiah does not fit their framework. It doesn't fit their theology. That's not what they're expecting. They're expecting this Messiah to come in like King David and wipe out their enemies, wipe out the Romans. They don't have a place for a crucified Messiah. And yet he tells them that he's going to die, and on the third day he's going to be raised. They're not ready for that. Jesus tells them in a mysterious way, because they don't have room for that, is he tells them that she's preparing me for my burial. And in her mind, she probably doesn't have that in her whole spectrum of devotion, because she's just doing this not because she loves Jesus. She's just doing this out of devotion to him. She has this very costly anointing oil, and she wants to pour it all out on Jesus. And she wasn't so much concerned of knowing that this is like a year's worth of labor. This is a year's worth of my wages, and yet she just pours it all out and doesn't even think twice about it, because Jesus is worth way more than that anointing oil is. And the gospel writers also mention that the fragrance of this anointing oil went throughout the whole room. You can imagine what it would be like having a bottle of cologne or a very expensive bottle of perfume just poured out upon your head, and it would make the whole room smell like that, or everywhere you went, for probably days on end. And they didn't shower as regularly as we did, or they didn't bathe regularly, because they weren't as accustomed to. And so Jesus would have had this smell on him for quite a while. And everywhere he went, disciples would have been reminded of this woman's act and devotion that she poured out upon Jesus. And our devotion at times may seem strange, or may seem odd to some people, even some people who are considered Christians, even people who are disciples, and yet our spilling ourselves out at Jesus' feet may seem to be a little bit too costly for some people, or may seem unwise. Why wasn't this spent on something else? But she wasn't so much concerned about it. There in that moment, she was just wanting to be obedient to Jesus. And lastly, consider that this woman's devotion, while she didn't understand all the intricacies of what she was doing, she just wanted to show her love for Christ. And out of that, Jesus says that this is going to be proclaimed along with the gospel throughout ages to come. Never underestimate your simple devotion, your simple obedience can have ripple effects from generations to come. We may underestimate all the time just us doing this, and we have all these grandiose ideas and these big plans of what we want to do, but sometimes it's just your simple obedience that really has the most cause and effect. For this woman, she wasn't thinking to herself, well, John's going to write this in his gospel. I hope Matthew finds this out. I hope the gospel writers write this down, and I hope this goes throughout generations. I want my name to be in there. She wasn't thinking about that. And she wasn't definitely thinking about preparing Jesus for his burial. And yet Jesus says that's what she was doing. We may not understand the effects that our devotion is going to have, but the Lord can use that to have great effects throughout generations.